Hi everyone, welcome back to the Shoebill Studio. I'm Steve, and today we're going to be diving into the Virtues of Bushido, the Kickstarter-exclusive Survivor expansion for Zombicide White Death. This box gives you 7 new survivors, each with a katana that has both a chi-enabled and also a normal side, and that makes the weapons usable across both White Death and Eternal Empire. But the survivors themselves don't come with chi skills, so it's kind of like a halfway implementation of the chi system across this particular expansion. And we'll get to that later on in the video. But first, before we get into mechanics, I want to talk about the inspiration behind this expansion because it's kind of a big deal. This Survivor X-Pack is based on Akira Kurosawa's 1954 film Seven Samurai, which isn't just one of the greatest films of all time, it's also one of the most important and influential films, period. This is a movie that inspired directors like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg to create action-adventure masterpieces that they're so well known for throughout the 80s and 90s, certainly films that are foundational to my childhood experience and also foundational to modern cinema. The film itself is a story of sacrifice and courage and the human cost of violence, all wrapped in a cinematic style that shaped decades of filmmaking. And if you haven't seen the film, well, Seven Samurai tells a story of a poor village in feudal Japan that's been raided repeatedly by bandits. The farmers of said village have finally decided that it's enough and they're going to hire samurai to protect themselves. But since they can't afford elite samurai warriors, they're told by the village elder to find hungry samurai. And that's the thematic heart of the movie. It's carried through to this expansion as well. You get a ragtag band of warriors, some old, some young, some battle-hardened, and some just plain lying about their skills for a shot at glory and maybe some redemption in there as well. It's a beautifully human story, and that's what Virtues of Bushido is really, I think, trying to capture. And because of this artistic design decision, there are both good and also less than ideal outcomes pertaining to the usefulness and validity of this expansion when considered alongside other Survivor expansions. But more importantly, when compared to the 6 core set survivors that I believe make up the benchmark for White Death's survivor pool. If you're not familiar with White Death or Eternal Empire, I've made full video reviews and a complete all-in buyer's guide for the entirety of the White Death range. Links are in the description and on screen. So let's talk about what works well. And I think the first thing is obvious. It's that the 7 samurai are here, albeit they have all been renamed. They don't use the original character names from the film, but each survivor clearly maps to a character from Seven Samurai, and some of the design choices reflect that. Not all of them, but some of them. Some examples are a little silly or cheeky. For instance, Jin, who's inspired by Katsushiro, the young romantic samurai from the film, has an orange skill called Hit and Run. And it might be a subtle reference to Hit It and Quit It, referring to his last-minute one-night stand with Shino. But there are other examples as well. For instance, Yoshitada, inspired by Kanbei, is the grizzled leader of the group and is steady rockin' brother-in-arms +1 combat action at red level, sort of giving you real leadership vibes. And then there's Rei, who's inspired by Kyuzo, is the best swordsman of the group and can spec into Swordmaster at orange, as well as having +1 to melee dice rolls at blue. Accurate and efficient with his blade, very Kyuzo. And then perhaps the most thematic of all, the drunken eccentric Makoto or Kikuchio. It starts with hold your nose at blue and gets access to is that all you've got at orange. I'll explain all of these skills in further detail during the Survivor Breakdown section. So the next thing that this expansion does well is it really offers up some strong thematic roleplay potential. I think that this might be its biggest strength, and this set practically begs you to run a homebrew 7 Samurai campaign. I mean, there's a lot of great story beats in Kurosawa's masterpiece, and imagine a 10-mission saga built around these 7 characters. That could be really amazing. The third thing this expansion does well is maintaining compatibility with the core set and reducing player stress load by including built-in guard actions on each survivor card. This really helps in the management of all of the things that are going on the board so that you don't have to keep track of an additional guard action card that's, floating off to the side of your player dashboard. And additionally, each of these samurai come with a katana that has both a chi-enabled side and a standard side. And so These weapons are more or less plug and play into both the White Death core set, as well as the Eternal Empire campaign, where the chi system is put into place. And the fourth and final thing that this expansion has done really well that caught my attention is that the blue level skills are strong and flavorful. And it feels like they've really gone out of their way to try to match those initial skills along with the actual characters that they're assigned to. They give you a clear sense of class fantasy and personality, and if you have watched any of my Zombicide reviews, you know that that's a big deal to me. They feel distinct, and many of the guard skills also feel good as well, so that's a nice bonus. But the blue skills, I really feel like across the board shine as far as character design is concerned. They all feel fun and enjoyable. So before we get into the things that I don't think work, let's go through each of the characters and talk about the skills that they have available to them. All right, first up, we've got Makoto, and I feel like I should mention that each of the samurai that are included in this set have sort of an unwritten skill that is actually included on the reference card that says that all of these samurai starts with katana at blue. But Makoto has the hold your nose and also the one free guard action abilities at blue. Hold your nose is great. It's essentially if you kill the last zombie in your space, you can loot the body, and that lets you draw a single equipment card from the equipment card deck. Now this can go wrong and you can get cards that spawn zombies in corruption zones, but this is a really fun thing, and if you watched a couple weeks ago, I made a short actually about looting zombies and how enjoyable that sort of is as a house rule that I play with from time to time. And then at orange, we've got +1 free melee action, and is that all you've got? And this is one of the reasons why I think Makoto is one of the best designed from a thematic standpoint, because you're looting gear off of dead bodies if you can manage to kill the final zombie in your space, but then is that all you've got allows you to negate wounds by sloughing off spare equipment from your inventory. This also really just kind of leans into the reality about Makoto, who is inspired by Kikuchiyo from the film. And Kikuchiyo is like a eccentric drunk who has sort of lied his way onto this band of samurai, and so is using every skill at their disposal to be able to take down the bandits, but in this case the zombies. And then at red, you've got +1 free combat action, as well as jump and lucky. And I think lucky is sort of the cherry on top here that allows this somewhat untrained warrior to fight fiercely, against hordes that really he has no business fighting against. So you get lots and lots of rerolls. All right, next up we've got Isamu, who is actually inspired by Heihachi. Isamu starts with damage to melee, and guards also do damage to melee. So this is your brute killer right from the jump. At yellow, we have the standard 1 action, and then at orange, we've got +1 die melee, and then +1 free melee action. These are fairly beige skills at this point, but increasing your ability to do 2 damage, or your frequency at which you can do 2 damage, seems to be sort of where those orange skills are leading our friend Isamu. At red, you've got +1 free combat action, and then roll 6, +1 damage melee, and then you've got shove. Shove being at red feels a little bit bizarre considering it's so often sort of like a tank's first ability, but the chance to be able to spec into doing 3 damage regularly with your standard melee attacks by rolling 6 really is a very powerful thing that puts Isamu in a category of very powerful, but kind of beige. Next up, we've got Rei, who's inspired by Kyuzo from the film, and Rei is essentially our best swordsman of the group. And that is definitely reflected by their skills. This is one that leans into the lore and theme of Seven Samurais pretty well. At blue, we've got +1 to dice rolls melee, and then the guard skill is damage to melee. So similar to Isamu in that regard. At orange, Rei has got +1 dice melee, and then Swordmaster. And I don't really ever see myself doing anything but taking Swordmaster here, especially considering that all of your friends have katana, and so you could be dual-wielding katana, Leonardo style, a la the Ninja Turtles pretty quickly with Rei. At red, you've got +1 die to melee, as well as +1 free melee action, and then finally the creme de la creme, Bloodlust melee. And while Bloodlust often shows up earlier in skill trees for a lot of characters as sort of a means to get a melee character a leg up in the game, having this show up at the very end really does feel thematic to Rei. You know, as the fight against the bandits get more and more intense, you know, folks get more and more desperate and bloodthirsty. So Rei is another one that I think has been designed really well to match their counterpart in the film. Next up, we've got Yoshitada, who is inspired by Kanbei from the film, and this is sort of the leader of the group. He's the oldest, and he's got the most skill from a tactical and sort of experience standpoint. At blue level, we've got Escalation Melee, which is just a great skill to have really at any level. It allows you to roll more and more dice. Every consecutive time that you do a melee action, you add 1 die for the iterative number that you're on. And then he's got +1 free guard actions. At orange, we've got +1 free melee action, and then roll 6 +1 die melee. And then at red, we've got +1 die combat, +1 free combat action, and then brother in arms, +1 free combat action. This character for me is a little bit split. I love that there's the brother in arms action. You know, it really does feel like it leans into the leadership role that Yoshitada would have on the battlefield with his 6 other samurai. But everything in between feels like filler. It feels like it sort of falls flat from a thematic standpoint. And that bums me out because you would think that the leader of this samurai group would have some more flavor, and I feel like more unique things that they would be able to accomplish. Next up, we have Tadashi, who is inspired by Gorobei in the film, and this is actually our ranged character as per the skills and also as per Gorobei in the film. Gorobei is sort of known as an archer, and so starts at blue with Marksman, which allows you to select your targets that you hit in whatever space you're attacking with a ranged attack. And then their guard skill is Damage to Ranged. Standard yellow, and then at orange we've got +1 free melee action, +1 free ranged action, and then at red we've got +1 free combat action, and then damage to melee, and then the third is damage to ranged. Tadashi is one of the most disappointing designs, in my opinion, in this set. It's sort of like we don't know what to do with this guy. I get that, like, you know, he's an all-arounder who can get into ranged and melee, but this set really does not want for melee fighters. It actually is extremely homogeneous as far as the abilities that folks can get into when it comes to combat. They're all melee fighters. They all start with a katana. So the fact that we've got Tadashi with Marksman at blue, and then we don't have really solid options for like a dedicated ranger, I get that it's not exactly true to the film, but this still is Zombicide. I feel like we should have leaned into designing a ranged combat powerhouse, sort of like Dragomir. Dragomir has so many great options that make it very clear that he's supposed to go ranged. So Tadashi, while very powerful, sort of feels like he's hindered by being like slammed into a hybrid position when could have probably just been kept as a ranger. Next up, we've got Homare, who's inspired by Shichiroji, and he starts with shove as his blue skill, and then his guard action is push. So similar to Ogon from the core set, the exact same blue setup. At orange, we've got +1 die to combat, as well as +1 free combat action. And then at red, we've got +1 die to combat, +1 free melee action, or +1 free move action. This is sort of a similar problem, in my opinion, to Tadashi, where, you know, Ogon really slots into this sort of taunty, tanky character. And Homare starts that way, and then I don't feel like I get a real good sense as to what he's good at after we get into orange, you know. Even orange, you know, it's obvious that we're buffing combat, but the addition of +1 free move action at red is confusing to me. Next up is Jin, inspired by Katsushiro, the young samurai, the youngest in the group, in fact, who starts at blue with +1 free move action, and then their guard skill is evade. And then at orange, it's +1 free melee action, or hit and run. And hit and run allows you to leave a space with zombies in it as long as you've killed a zombie without having to pay those extra activations for whatever zombies are left in that space. At red, we've got +1 free combat action, and then we've got escalation melee, and then we've got jump. As far as Jin's thematic accuracy, It's sort of there, but I don't think it's as, as obvious as somebody like Makoto. So now that we've reviewed all the survivors and their skills, let's talk about what doesn't work. And the first one for me is a fairly big one, which is no chi skills for survivors. Even though the weapons that are included in this expansion, the katanas, are chi compatible, the survivors themselves don't have chi skills on their character sheets. And what that means is if you want to use them in Eternal Empire with chi mechanics, you're going to need to manually assign chi cards. And I hate how fiddly the chi cards are. You've already got objective cards, and sometimes those things are filling up your inventory or just cluttering your dashboard space. And now you're adding a loose sort of like grouping of chi cards off to the side, and you don't really have anywhere to put them. So the UI of this sort of just eats up more table space, and it's a mess unless you can dedicate extra room for every single survivor that needs one of these chi cards. I understand that the chi skills themselves are powerful enough that redesigning, the skill setups is kind of required, but I would have preferred to have seen these survivors come with 2 sets of character skill cards, one for use with chi skills and one for use in the core set of White Death. Especially considering that this is a Kickstarter exclusive that is likely owned by people that have White Death Core and Eternal Empire. It just would have made sense, I think, to be able to fold them into whatever you wanted to play them with. The second thing that I feel like this expansion has flubbed is that the weapon choices feel wrong. This every character starts with a katana thing, I don't like it. And I don't actually think that it aligns with the source material. Samurai, I think, always have a katana on their person. I think that's pretty standard. But a lot of these characters are not necessarily katana users exclusively. For instance, Tadashi is an archer. The skill set would say that, as well as their film counterpart, Gorobei. Why not lean into what Zombicide kind of needs, which is a more balanced team? For me, I want to play the 7 Samurai together because that's what the movie's about. So not having those initial starting weapons set up and feeling like I'm being forced to use these katanas as a means to interface with how this expansion is designed doesn't feel right to me. And Tadashi isn't the only one that has this weapon mismatch. You've got Homare, who is inspired by Shichiroji from the film, who is a stated spear user. And there are so many great spears in White Death. Why not just give them the starting spear? That just doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, try to align it with even just like the canon of the film. Now, these are problems that are very easily house ruled by just using some of the weapons that are from the expansion or from the core set. But the final one is Makoto, who is inspired by Kikuchiyo, who famously uses a nodachi, which is like a long sword version of a katana. So that's almost half of these survivors that feel like they've been sort of shoehorned into this sort of katana space, which not only feels bad from a balance standpoint right out of the gate, having 7 dudes with swords, and nobody can shoot a bow. Additionally, there are no magic users here. It's not that they can't loot spells and use them, but there's nobody who has a skill set to make use of all of the magic stuff that is in the deck. Now, canonically, it doesn't fit with 7 Samurai, but it does sort of feel like maybe the design didn't take that into consideration as much as it needed to. Zombicide and the IPs that they use for these expansions do need to work together to create something that is new from both of the IPs, not just, well, nobody's going to use magic when they're trying to play with all 7 Samurai. And I know that you can mix and match heroes or survivors from all sorts of different expansions. You could take a couple of your favorite of the 7 Samurai and play them with the core set. But, as the original source material would dictate, I really wanted to see how these guys would work as a team. Moving forward, I'm almost certain that I'm always going to be house ruling this so that the characters get more appropriate starting weapons, because for me, as it stands, it doesn't really feel right to have Tadashi without a bow, at the very least to start. The third and probably most problematic thing that this expansion doesn't do well for me is that it feels like a lot of the orange and red skills are too generic. They're somewhat vanilla, pretty boring, honestly. Once you hit orange level, like half of the survivors start to feel vanilla. And you get a lot of +1 melee action, +1 die to melee attacks, other stat buffs, but with 0 flavor. And it feels a little bit like, you know, back in old school WoW, when your damage tree would have an option where each time you put a point into a skill, it would increase your overall damage by 1% and could take 5 points. And so it's like you get some extra DPS, but no other effects. It just doesn't feel that fun. It is good. It's powerful. It's great to have an additional 5% damage or an extra roll or an extra action. Nobody's going to argue that increasing your action economy that way isn't useful. But there is something to be said about doing these sorts of things and having it be interesting. And I feel like most of these orange and red skills just don't really hold a candle to a lot of the things that the core set survivors can do. Those survivors really feel like they have class identities and work well as a team. And these guys, I don't really feel like they work that well as a team all of the time. So my final verdict regarding Virtues of Bushido is that compared to the White Death core survivors, this set really doesn't stack up. Those original 6 have strong, clear class identities, they've got good synergy, they've got balanced team dynamics, and they've got thematic skills right from the start. The Virtues of Bushido characters, not so much. It's not consistent across the board. Most of them start to feel a little thematically undercooked once you get to orange level, and the lack of appropriate starting weapons, in my opinion, really holds these characters back. That said, if you're a Kurosawa fan or a Seven Samurai nut, and you play Zombicide, well, then this is fan service done right, in my opinion. It's definitely not for, I think, the average player. It's for people who want to roleplay Seven Samurai. And if somebody out there ever makes a proper Seven Samurai campaign, even a short one, I think that this expansion could suddenly feel very sought after. But if you're just looking to add more survivors to White Death, this is not the best value. It doesn't enhance the core experience, and it won't make your games more balanced or exciting, in my opinion. But if you're in it for the theme, if you're here for the Kurosawa vibes, then you have hit the f***ing jackpot. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button. It definitely helps more than you think. And if you want more deep dive coverage of Zombicide content, including honest reviews and buyer's guides, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more coming. But really what I want to know is, do you guys have thoughts on the Virtues of Bushido? Are you planning on running like a Seven Samurai campaign? Are you in the middle of developing your own homebrewed version right now? Because if you do, I'm kind of interested. Anyways, drop a comment below. I really want to hear how you guys are using this set. I'm very curious. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.